Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's Wisdom Dharma Chat. Thank you, everyone who's with us in person. And thank you most of all to Bhikkhu Bodhi for joining us, the beloved translator of many of the Nikaya translations that Wisdom is so honored to publish. Thank you for joining us and welcome.
That's my pleasure, yeah.
I have some good news that we recently published this book, Noble Truths, Noble Paths. And the good news is that this was our most popular book this year. Can you believe that? So that's incredible. So we were wanting to have you here to celebrate that and then also delve into it a little bit.
Okay, yeah, fine.
So does that sound okay?
Yeah.
And I thought maybe we'd start with, how did this book come about?
Yeah, first I didn't originally plan to produce this book, but I've been for quite a number of years teaching a Pali class at Zhuangyan Monastery, where I live in upstate New York. And we came to the point where we had gone through the elementary Pali, intermediate Pali, and we wanted to read Pali suttas. I wanted to teach them to read Pali suttas. And so I started taking these short suttas from the Samyutta Nikaya, the connected discourses of the Buddha, and we went through them in maybe it took about 2 years to go through all of the suttas that I'd collected. And then I thought, as some people suggested to me, it would be good to prepare a book based on this Pali course that I was giving, so that people who are not able to attend the course, we only had like about 12, actually we started the Pali class with like 20 people. As the time went by, it got reduced to about six regular students. So I thought it was a good idea, and then I prepared a book, called Reading the Buddha's Discourses in Pali, which is based on that course. And what I did is to take short suttas from the Samyutta Nikaya, the suttas that I used in the class, and then I would have a Pali passage, a word-for-word literal English translation, then a natural English translation, and then notes with vocabulary and grammatical explanations. And then that was published, I think, back in 2017. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I think that's right.
And I noticed you printed 1,000 copies the first run, and you told me it got sold out, I think, within a week.
Yeah.
And I was thinking to myself, do people really...
How many people know Pali?
Do they really know what they're purchasing? Probably quite a bit of a number of people from that 1,000 who wanted the book picked it up, looked at it, and said, "Oh no, I made a mistake."
They're here tonight. They were trying to understand what actually is in this book.
Yeah. So anyway, then it occurred to me that it would be useful to just take the natural English translated passages from this book, and then put them together into a book not intended for Pali students, but intended for those who just want to be able to read the suttas.
Yeah.
And that is how this book came to be.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic in that way because, you know, when you pick up these books that you've translated, so I'll grab one, hopefully it won't knock everything over. This can be quite intimidating, right? This is big. And you've got to understand that these pages are thin. So this book is, what is this book? Nearly 1,500 pages.
Yeah.
So if someone comes along and says, I really want to know what the actual Buddha, what he actually said.
Yeah.
And then they're like, you know, they're not ready for this. This is quite an undertaking.
Yeah.
And the other thing about the Pali Canon is, like, this is called the middle-length discourses.
Yeah.
But it's not like structured in a way to learn Dharma, if I can say
exactly.
Is that true? Yeah.
I mean, that is the problem with people picking up whole Nikayas and trying to understand the Buddha's teachings just by starting with the first sutta and working through. You don't see the structure, the patterns, the sort of the logic behind the arrangement.
So what is the logic behind the arrangement of, say, the middle-length discourses? Why are they arranged in that way?
What is the principle of organization in this book?
Well, we know the principle of organization, you know, it's like the size of the text, right?
Yeah.
That's how they got into this. But then the structure within that, why were some put here and some put there?
Well, if you're taking the reason for the organization of Nikayas, then at least a starting point would be the size of the suttas.
Yes.
So we have Digha Nikaya are the long discourses, then the Majjhima Nikaya are the middle-length discourses, and then there are shorter discourses which are compiled into the other two Nikayas according to two different organizational principles. The Samyutta Nikaya maybe is the one that shows the most reasonable system of organization, since the suttas are classified primarily by way of topic.
Yes.
So we have suttas, for example, on dependent origination, the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, 4 noble truths, the various factors of the path, like the Noble Eightfold Path, 4 foundations of mindfulness, 7 enlightenment factors. So they're all put together into their own separate chapters.
Yeah. And then what about within a particular Nikaya? How's the structure decided that we start here and then we have this next sutta? Because it doesn't, to my uninformed eye,
sometimes there's a little more that binds them together, except a word, term, or expression that might be used in several suttas.
Okay.
So I have a suspicion that, we don't have any factual evidence for this, but I think maybe the first 30 suttas or so of the Majjhima Nikaya may have been intended for new converts to Buddhism, particularly to the monastic life, to introduce them to fundamentals of the Buddhist teaching and the Buddhist training. Because we could see here, if I could just refresh my memory.
Yeah. So this is the beginner's book? Is that what you're saying?
I would certainly say it's not for a modern beginner, but say fairly new recruits into the monastic life.
And then would it make sense that the long discourses is then for the scholar?
No, it seems that the long discourses, and this is my hypothesis, sort of based on the scholarly work by some other scholars, that it seems to me that the suttas of the Digha Nikaya are intended largely for an audience that are not Buddhist, but in people in the general Indian culture and society, in order to convince them of the superiority of the Buddha's teaching to other prevalent teachings, and the superiority of the Buddha to the Brahmins and even to the gods that the Brahmins are worshipping.
So a little bit more convincing needed. So longer ones.
And also in the Digha Nikaya we find like suttas that are intended maybe of a more popular nature, sort of that blend in with the dominant Indian culture of that particular period.
And so would it be the Samyutta Nikaya that the scholars are picking up mostly? Is that
I would say that the suttas in the Samyutta Nikaya are intended maybe more, again this is hypothesis, for those monastics who have gone through and learned the basics of the teaching and now want a wide variety of suttas that give detailed pictures of particular doctrines. Yeah. So, say through the Majjhima Nikaya, you get acquainted with dependent origination through a number of suttas, but now you turn to the chapter on dependent origination in the Samyutta Nikaya, and you see it from this angle, that angle. Yeah. You see different ways of sort of scrambling up the 12 factors so that you can see different relationships amongst those factors.
Fantastic. And so how then did you think about, when you were putting together your, anthology, how did you think about structuring it? Because I think this is quite brilliant what you've done here. So how did you come up with that?
And also, you see, I based the structure in this book on what I take to be the underlying structure, the overall structure of the Samyutta Nikaya, which maybe gets a little bit sort of lost to perception because of the way this collection has come down to us. The way this collection has come down to us in the Pali tradition, they've put the first book, the collection of verses in which you have suttas in verse or mixed prose and verse, dealing with a variety of topics that are mainly not so central to the Dhamma itself. But now when you look at the main chapters of the Samyutta Nikaya, you could see that it's actually the organization, the arrangement of the main chapters, if you just change some things around, is elaborating on the structure of the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah.
There's a chapter on the Four Noble Truths which is put at the end of the Samyutta Nikaya. In this book, I put it at the beginning. So I use the Four Noble Truths as sort of the entryway into this book. But then in the Buddha's first discourse, and in several other discourses, he says, what is the truth of dukkha, or suffering? Yeah. And then not going through all of the other factors of dukkha, but he says simply, it is the 5 clinging aggregates that I call dukkha. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then I made the second chapter in this book, the chapter on the 5 aggregates. And then there's another sutta which says, what is the noble truth of dukkha? In that sutta, he says, it is the 6 internal sense bases. Mm. The internal sense bases of the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and the mind faculty. And so in this book, I took the chapter from the Samyutta Nikaya on the 6 sense bases and made that the second chapter. And I call that, I think, don't remember the title that I gave to it.
Yeah.
The channels through which suffering originates.
Yeah.
Because it's through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind faculty that all 5 aggregates come to be, or at least the 4 mental aggregates, together with the material form aggregates. So there you get the 5 aggregates. So then I have all of these suttas, the short suttas, or at least a variety of short suttas on the 6 sense bases. Okay, so that covers the first noble truth, the noble truth of dukkha, or suffering. Then we come to the second noble truth, and in the sutta on the turning the wheel of the Dhamma, the Buddha says simply, what is the origin of dukkha? It is this craving. Okay, but the formula for dependent origination is a kind of more elaborate explanation of the origin of dukkha, a fuller account of the origin of dukkha, and to the cessation side of dependent origination, an account of the third noble truth, the cessation of dukkha. So I put in following the chapter on the 6 sense bases, then I put the chapter on dependent origination, which covers both the origin and cessation of dukkha. Then the next chapter, I think it's a chapter on the way.
Path and the way.
Is that the case?
Yeah, path and the way.
Yeah. Okay, so that is the chapter on the way to the cessation of dukkha. And the sort of concise way to explain that is the Noble Eightfold Path. But in the 5th book of the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha has not only the Noble Eightfold Path, but he has chapters, or the organizers have chapters on the 7 factors of enlightenment, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 5 spiritual faculties, the 5 powers, the 4 bases of accomplishment, and so on. So in the next chapter in this book, is that chapter 4 or 5?
Chapter 6. Chapter 5 is the path and the way.
Yeah.
We have the different divisions.
Yeah, that is the one.
Yeah.
Okay, so the chapter on the path and the way, I took suttas from 3 of the chapters in the Samyutta Nikaya. So I started out with the suttas on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, because the basic practice, you could say, in developing the higher stages of the path is the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 satipatthanas. And when they reach a certain level of maturity, then they sort of blend into the 7 factors of enlightenment. So that becomes the second subdivision of that chapter. And then when the 7 factors of enlightenment reach a certain level of maturity, then they bring into being the truly liberating, world-transcending Noble Eightfold Path. So that chapter has 3 subdivisions.
Yeah.
The 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and the Noble Eightfold Path. And then at the end, I brought in that short chapter on the sort of the goal of the teaching, the final destination of the teaching, which is Nibbana.
Which I wanted to jump into straight away. Yeah. But Bhikkhu Bodhi said, hold me to hold my horses, and we'll do this properly. And so basically what you're saying is this book takes you through the complete path that the Buddha taught using the Buddha's own words.
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. You start out with, the fundamental teaching of the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah.
And then the suffering you explained by the five aggregates. Yeah. And then, so that's the second chapter. And then the third chapter, you go into the origin of suffering. And so you talk about the senses, basically.
Well, those are the channels.
They're the channels to that. Yeah. And then dependent origination is the deeper understanding of the origin.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And then you get into the path in chapter 5. Yeah. Then chapter 6 is Nirvana.
Yeah.
So that's the whole complete in this size book. And it's like really pithy, straight to the point from the Buddha. So really, if you want to, that person we described at the start, who was like, I want to read how the Buddha taught to get to enlightenment. And I want to read the Buddha's words. And then instead of picking up, where's that big book? This one.
Yeah, I wouldn't suggest people begin with.
But here's a good start.
And
from here, this might be a way into these other places, right?
Yeah, though I also want to point out that I put together another anthology years ago, I think 2005, called In the Buddha's Words, and it's called an anthology of discourses from the Pali Canon. And so the question might come up like, what is the relationship of this book to that book? In this book, I wanted to cover the Buddha's teachings more broadly than this book covers. Because here, you see, the Buddha doesn't teach only the path to liberation, but the Buddha teaches people in different stages of spiritual maturity, and he directs his teaching to the different concerns of people. So in this book, I wanted to give a wide-ranging, to encompass the Buddha's teachings in a more wide-ranging way. And so I have here teachings, let me see if I could refresh myself about the organization. We begin with the human condition, the Buddha's perspective on the human condition. Then we come to suttas which give a kind of brief biographical sketch of the Buddha's early life up to his first discourse. Then I have a chapter called Approaching the Dhamma. How does one approach the Dhamma? Does one approach it out of unquestioning faith? Or can one question and examine the teaching? Okay, then I have the basic scheme of this are 3 goals of Buddha's teaching. One is the happiness in this present life, happiness in what's called mundane or secular life. And so this deals with the Buddha's teachings on the family, relations of parents and children, husbands and wives, right livelihood, teachings directed to women, the community, how to establish the community and hold the community together, the principles of order in the political realm. Okay, then the next section deals with the way to a fortunate rebirth. So here I bring in suttas on the teachings of karma and its result, and then the suttas directed to those who are not yet ready for Nibbana, but who are seeking a good rebirth, a fortunate rebirth. So there we have teachings on the practice of merit, meritorious deeds, giving, generosity, the moral discipline, and then the types of meditation that are intended to be more preparing the way to a higher rebirth rather than towards liberation. This would be the 4 Brahmaviharas or divine abodes, and maybe the devotional types of meditations. Well, actually, this gets quite far-reaching then. Deepening one's perspective on the world. So this is how to move from aspiring to a better rebirth to seeing more deeply into the real nature of the human condition or the condition of sentient beings. Then coming to broad suttas that cover in an encompassing way the way to liberation. and then suttas that focus more precisely and in more detail on mastering the mind through meditation, then the wisdom teachings, which in a way
This is
covers
the wisdom teachings. Yeah.
some of the material in this book,
Yeah.
and then the different planes of higher realization.
So this book is a more like a holistic view of the Buddhist teachings about having a good life, having a good next life.
Exactly.
And this is more the, hey, we want to go to enlightenment.
Yeah, that's why I call it the heart essence.
The heart essence.
I think I picked up that subtitle maybe from some book on Tibetan.
Probably, yeah, it sounds like a Tibetan title, right? Yeah. So I think we've done our preliminaries now. We're going to jump into some juicy topics.
Yeah.
And, I was really wanting to sort of start with the end, which is a little bit unconventional, but, partly we want to know where we're going.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So where's the Buddha telling us we might be able to go? And what is the highest goal for a Buddhist? And we hear about Nirvana, Nibbana. Yeah. And so my sort of question, I wanted to start there. What is this? What is Nibbana? And is that even a good question? Like, is Nibbana a thing?
Okay. Okay, the way I see it, the Buddha has different ways of approaching the question, what is Nibbana? So I would maybe divide his way of characterizing the nature of Nibbana, maybe put it into three categories, three classes. One would be, I use the word metaphysically or ontologically explicit statements about Nibbana. I know ontology and metaphysics, we think the Buddha avoided metaphysics, avoided ontology. I don't think that's the case. In order to talk about anything, you really need an underlying metaphysic. Yeah. Okay, so ontological or metaphysical statements about Nibbana, then statements extolling Nibbana as a desirable state. Suttas or statements that are intended to inspire in people the wish, desire to attain Nibbana. And then the third category would be suttas which describe Nibbana or even define Nibbana in terms of the task that has to be performed in order to attain Nibbana. Should I elaborate on each of these?
Yeah, please.
It might be that I'm giving a lecture on Nibbana.
This is great. Okay. If that's what this is, perfect.
Okay, so what I call the ontological or metaphysical perspective. So there are certain words, and I put special emphasis on this because there's a view within certain circles in the Theravada tradition, particularly emanating maybe from a geographical region where Daniel comes from, where you come from, that Nibbana is really just non-existence.
Yeah.
And so the aim of the Buddha's teaching is to reach that state of non-existence. I have to say, with that, I always think, in that case, the Christian missionaries win. Because they're saying that this teaching has a very beautiful ethics, but it aims at complete annihilation. Okay.
So you think that's wrong?
Yeah, so I say that there are these terms with an ontological significance that the Buddha uses. Some of the words are dhātu, which we often translate as element, ayatana, base, pada or state, and even the word dhamma, which has a very broad meaning.
Yeah.
And so there are suttas which speak about Nibbana as a dhātu. In fact, in the suttas we have, let's see if I could get amata dhātu, that is the one, that is the deathless element.
Yeah.
So let us see, Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 64. The Buddha says that one contemplates the five aggregates as impermanent, dukkha, non-self, and then he uses a few other descriptive terms. And then one turns one's mind away from those things and focuses on the amata dhātu.
Yes.
And then with the mind focused on the deathless element, then one attains either the complete destruction of the defilements, or if there's still some clinging left, the state of non-returning.
We pause here for a sec. So the Buddha is actually saying in this statement that of something very familiar, that, you know, Buddhist practice is often contemplating the five aggregates and understanding their three natures, right?
Yeah.
Like, and selflessness being, impermanence being one of them, the suffering nature, right? But in this one, the Buddha is saying at a certain point, you turn away from that and focus, or what is, I'm interested in the verb, you turn towards the deathless element. What does that actually mean? What does it mean?
Is that, I don't think it's in that book.
Okay.
Because
there's a quote in there,
the
I think.
Majjhima Nikaya. Let me see if I can find it.
So we're actually turning away from this contemplation on the five aggregates as having these three natures. And we're focusing, I'm interested in the verb, focusing on a deathless element. So why are we turning away from this?
This is, I think this is not something that just happens sort of willfully, that you're contemplating the five aggregates and then you think, okay, enough of that, I'm going to turn to the deathless element. But I think this is what sort of naturally happens when insight into the nature of the five aggregates has reached its pinnacle. Then what happens, this is the way that commentarial tradition will explain it, that what arises is the world transcending path, the Lokuttara Magga arises, and that drops the conditioned phenomena as its object, and it focuses on, it actually experiences, sees, and realizes the unconditioned element. And that unconditioned state, that is the deathless element.
Otherwise known as Nibbana or Nirvana.
That is Nibbana,
So turn away. So it seems like it's not this like turning away. It seems like as you get to a certain level of realization on the nature of things, you automatically enter into this deathless element, otherwise known as Nibbana. And what we're trying to discover tonight is what is that thing, right? So this Nirvana comes out of this insight into the nature of things.
In fact, those three characteristics, the three main characteristics of conditioned phenomena are sometimes said to be, they're called doors to emancipation, vimokkha mukha, doors to emancipation, and each one sort of leads the mind to focus upon Nibbana in a different way as determined by the opposition between that characteristic and the nature of Nibbana. So it's said when you focus on phenomena, conditioned phenomena as impermanent, then when you reach that peak, that becomes the door to the perception, the realization of Nibbana as the signless element. Because it's devoid of the sign or features of conditioned phenomena, of impermanence. If you make the main focus of your contemplation the unsatisfactory or suffering nature of conditioned phenomena, that leads to the realization of Nibbana as the desireless or wishless element, because Nibbana is sort of the antidote to craving or desire. And then if one focuses, if one's insight emphasizes the non-self nature of conditioned phenomena, then when you reach the world transcending plane, then you experience or realize Nibbana as the sunyata, that's the door of sunyata, of the empty nature, Nibbana as emptiness.
So these, contemplating these three natures of things, the five aggregates, they're like doorways to Nibbana, let's say. Doorways to Nibbana. And it seems like that depending on which doorway you take, it gives you a different, Nibbana is described differently. Always in the negatively, it seems, the wishless state, signless. That's interesting. But we're going to say that it's not just a state of nothingness.
I'm going through sort of the different ontological
Yeah.
terms. So that we started off with the dhātu, with the element.
Yeah.
And the word element, it always signifies something that positively exists, that definitely exists. For example, the familiar scheme is 18 elements. Those would be the 6 sense faculties, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, their corresponding objects, and then 6 corresponding types of consciousness. So those are 18 elements. Then we have, well, there are other schemes about, of course, the 4 elements, the 4 material elements, earth, water, fire, air, and then sometimes space element is added and consciousness element. So those are things that are actually exist, that have a nature of their own. And so Nibbana as a dhātu, the Nibbana dhātu, or asankata dhātu, the unconditioned element, is something that exists, that has a nature of its own.
Yeah.
Okay, then another term that's used is ayatana. And so we have a sutta, I included it in this book actually.
So in this book, chapter 6 is all on Nibbana, and there's 2 short suttas. Is that the one you're after?
I don't think ayatana occurs here, but we have
base
it
doesn't occur
in this book.
One, So once we go on this exploration of Nibbana, I think we're going to try and work out what consciousness is.
365. Okay, so here the Buddha says there is that base. So this is ayatana, where there is neither earth nor water, fire nor air. Then he mentions the different planes of existence. And there is neither this world nor another world, neither sun nor moon. Here I say there is no coming, no going, no standing still, no passing away, and no being reborn. It is not established, not moving without support. This is the end of dukkha, the end of suffering.
And these are your arguments for Nibbana being something, not just nothingness, but being something more than that ontologically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So we've talked about 2 things. So you've talked about this idea of element dhātu, or ayatana is base, and so these are 2 things. And so now I'm sort of wanting to switch gears a little bit, but we can keep going if you want. And I want to bring in the idea of consciousness. Actually, if this is to be experienced, if this is to be perceived. This being Nibbana, this thing that exists ontologically more than nothingness or blankness. What's its relationship to consciousness? And the way I wanted to enter into this conversation is to start with your name, Bhikkhu Bodhi. So this word Bodhi. Could you tell me a little bit about what this word means? What is Bodhi? And when the Buddha was awakening. What's Bodhi mean, actually, is my question.
So Bodhi means enlightenment, the enlightenment of the Buddha. So it wasn't given to me because I've reached enlightenment, but I don't know, my teacher just gave it to me.
You must be close.
I wanted a longer name, but he gave me the name Bodhi. I said, how about Bodhi Jnana? Bodhi's good enough. How about Bodhi Siha, lion of enlightenment? Bodhi's good enough.
Yes. So you were like bargaining with your name.
His name was Ananda Maitreya, so how about Bodhi Maitreya, Maitreya Bodhi? No, Bodhi's good enough.
Nice. And so what's your, it means enlightenment, but what does, I guess, what's the relationship between Nibbana, the deathless state, and, this moment that the Buddha had, we call awakening or Bodhi?
Okay, so Bodhi and Nibbana are not the same in early Buddhism. Bodhi is the experience, the opening of the knowledge, not conceptual knowledge, the experiential knowledge by which one experiences Nibbana, and through that experience of Nibbana, eradicates, destroys certain of the bonds or fetters or defilements that keep one in bondage to the cycle of birth and death. I remember the commentaries actually they give several explanations of the word Bodhi. So they say Bodhi could be the knowledge of the four paths. So the four paths are like the four stages of enlightenment in early Buddhism. The path of stream entry, once returning, non-returning, arahatship. But then they also say that Bodhi is the knowledge of the fourth path, only the highest path. And then Bodhi is the knowledge of a Supreme Buddha. And then they say Bodhi is, sometimes they equate Bodhi, if I remember, even with the Sabanyuta Jnana or Savajñā Jnana, the omniscient knowledge of a Buddha. But in the broader sense, Bodhi is the opening of the faculty of wisdom to the point where one actually sees and realizes Nibbana. By seeing Nibbana at the same time, one is directly knowing the Four Noble Truths, because the way it's explained is that when you see and realize and experience Nibbana with the world-transcending path, there for the first time you really fully understand the meaning of Dukkha, the First Noble Truth. You're in the process of starting to eradicate the craving and the other defilements, which are the Second Noble Truth, and one is brought into being that world-transcending path that will culminate in full liberation.
Okay, so what we're learning tonight is that, the Buddhist contemplation on things, right? The five aggregates, for example, and the three natures of these things are like doorways into Nibbana. And you've taught us that, doing this practice, it's like Nibbana emerges from that practice. And that experience of that emergence is being equated with Bodhi. Is that fair?
So I wouldn't say Nibbana emerges from that experience, because Nibbana always exists.
Good, it's unconditioned.
You could say that what emerges from the contemplation is the experiencing, the realization of Nibbana.
Bodhi emerges from the contemplation.
We can say Bodhi emerges from the contemplation.
Bodhi emerges from the
and
contemplation.
Bodhi, or enlightenment, is the knowing, the experiencing of Nibbana and all four truths.
So the content of Bodhi is Nibbana, we could say. And so here's one thing that I'm thinking now is, of course, one of the five aggregates is consciousness, right? And so there's this sort of in the line you were reading, I think it said there's a turning away from the five aggregates for the emergence of Bodhi, which is the experience of Nibbana. And so if you're so I guess my question here now is, what is the relationship between Bodhi and consciousness?
Okay, consciousness as I start trying to conceptualize this in sort of broad terms, and then bringing in maybe an Abhidhammic perspective. Okay, so we have in early Buddhism 6 classes of consciousness. So there's eye consciousness, ear, nose, tongue, body consciousness. So none of those sense consciousnesses experiences Nibbana. So Nibbana is experienced and known through mind consciousness. It's an experience with mind consciousness. But within, you see, consciousness is just, maybe you could say, the awareness or the bare knowing, but the function of actually penetratively knowing is performed by a mental factor, a mental function. And that function or factor that sort of penetrates, understands, and realizes Nibbana will be the mental factor of panya, or this would be Sanskrit prajna, wisdom, which is conjoined with consciousness. But consciousness is more like sort of the background awareness. Consciousness itself maybe doesn't have the understanding. It's the prajna or panya that has the understanding.
Could we say that prajna or panya is an activity of consciousness?
Yeah, I think we could put it that way.
Yes. So of course, so then when we're going through this contemplation on things and these three natures of these things, and an experience is emerging, an experience of Nirvana, and we've defined that a little bit more now. That's not the five sense consciousness. We've turned away the five sense consciousness.
Yeah, certainly.
We've turned away from them.
Yeah.
But we haven't completely turned away from the sixth, it seems.
Yeah, yeah.
It's still there.
Yeah.
And actually what it's acting as is a type of, there's an activity going on, panya,
yeah, yeah.
wisdom activity.
Yeah.
And this constitutes the subjective side of Bodhi.
Yeah.
So the objective side of Bodhi is Nibbana,
yeah.
unconditioned.
Yeah.
The subjective side of Bodhi is consciousness acting in a way of prajna, which is conditioned, I understand, as I understand it. And so this is the experience of enlightenment that the Buddha had under the Bodhi tree.
Yeah.
If we are describing it. Okay, cool, very cool.
Yeah.
So then when someone who's achieves enlightenment and then passes
away.
Yeah, and they're again in Nirvana.
Yeah.
It seems that the mental consciousness Bodhi must continue. Is that true or not?
Well, from the perspective of the early suttas, all five aggregates fall away and cease. So there isn't a mind or consciousness continuing into Nibbana.
So then this seems different to what we just described. The moment of Nibbana.
Yeah.
It's important that the subjective side is consciousness. The aggregate is there.
Yeah.
But then it seems like there's this Nibbana.
Yeah.
Ongoing Nibbana.
Yeah.
Where there's no consciousness, but there's Nibbana.
Yeah.
And that seems to be getting awfully close to an idea of cessation, is what I would say, which is what we wanted to avoid at the start of the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that this seems a bit paradoxical.
It's paradoxical.
Yeah, but certainly I would say that the suttas make it very clear that Nibbana is, as I said, an unconditioned element, a reality, a state, whatever.
Yeah.
And also they speak without any qualification about the five aggregates as coming to an end with the attainment of Nibbana.
Yeah.
And so, but the way I sometimes try to resolve that paradox or maybe contradiction to myself is to think that what happens is that it's not that consciousness is sort of continuing in Nibbana.
Yeah.
Because if it's continuing, it would have to have some thoughts.
Yeah.
So what is it thinking?
Yeah.
But the way I formulate this to myself is that consciousness becomes, can we create a verb, nirvanized?
Yeah, nirvanized, yeah.
Yeah.
I like this way of thinking because normally the consciousness has a base.
Yeah.
The mano
Yeah.
ayatana, yeah?
Yeah.
And so at this point when the great practitioner passes, this base is no longer there, just like the I sense consciousness base.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if the Nirvana itself could act as a base. And indeed, earlier you said it's described as a...
It's described as a base, but not in the sense of a base for consciousness. When ayatana is used in that other sense, we speak about the 12 bases, then those are the bases for consciousness. Mm-hmm. But it's an interesting point. I've just never thought of it quite.
Yeah, because we want there to be, we don't want there to be consciousness as in the aggregate.
Yeah.
But we want Nirvana to be ongoingly experienced because it's not just a state of nothingness.
I say so, definitely.
Yeah. And so then there's a subjective element to this Nibbana as we understand it.
And of course there are passages and suttas which describe Nibbana as paramasukham, supreme bliss.
Yeah.
And what is the other one? I think it's paramasanti, the perfect peace.
Yeah. So it seems like Nirvana is a different type of experience.
Yeah.
Completely different to however we've experienced the world.
Yeah, like in early Buddhism, when experience is formulated and sort of dissected and analyzed, it's always analyzed in terms of the five aggregates.
Yeah.
And then the suttas are pretty clear that the 5 aggregates within conditioned experience cease with the attainment of Nibbana element without residue remaining. Yeah, in fact, there's a distinction made in some suttas between the Nibbana element with a residue remaining, and that is Nibbana as experienced by the Arahat, the liberated one, during life, as long as the body continues, the life faculty functions. And then there's the Anupadisesa Nibbana dhātu, the element of Nirvana without any residue remaining. But it would seem that there would have to be some experiential element, it's difficult to formulate this, in order for the idea of Paramasukha, supreme bliss, and Paramasanti, supreme peace, to have any meaning.
So even this Nirvana without residue remaining is described as blissful. Is that also described as blissful?
Yeah, what's interesting, I'm trying to think whether there's any statement. Actually, what is said about the Nibbana element without residue remaining is only, it's very, very terse, that all that is felt becomes cool right here.
All that is felt becomes cool right here.
Yeah, cool in the sense of like a fire going out.
Interesting. So what do you make of that?
Well, it's referring to what we think of as regular feeling, because it is contrasted with the Nibbana element with residue remaining. Because when the residue that remains is this body with its sense faculties and the mental activity. So in the course of life, the way the explanation goes, the liberated one continues to experience pleasure and pain, what is agreeable and disagreeable, dependent on these 6 sense faculties. And so with the attainment of Nibbana without residue, the 6 sense faculties come to an end. And so there's no more experiencing of pleasure, pain, the agreeable and disagreeable.
There's no contact anymore, so there cannot be feeling, right?
Yeah. So I wouldn't say that experience of supreme bliss, supreme peace, is a feeling in the way that feeling is understood as an ordinary conditioned phenomena.
So would then you say that the bliss is associated with Nirvana, or even the experiencing of it, is that conditioned or unconditioned? Like the Nirvana is conditioned, is unconditioned.
Nibbana is unconditioned.
But this description, these adjectives describing Nirvana, is just, so this is a bliss that is the bliss of something unconditioned.
It would have to be unconditioned,
and therefore also the experience of it would have to be an unconditioned experience.
It would be an unconditioned state, an unconditioned bliss.
Yeah, which is completely different to the experience that we have.
Exactly,
Yeah. And Nirvana is right here, right now, is it or not?
Well, Nibbana is always existent.
Yeah.
It's a little tricky if you say that it's right here, right now.
Where's it?
You get the idea. If I could put the direction into my
where's the GPS for Nirvana?
If I turn the corner, am I going to run into it?
Yep.
But it's always present in the sense that because it's unconditioned, it doesn't have any arising, and it doesn't undergo any kind of transformation, and you have to pachatam veditabo vinyuhi, you have to realize it individually for yourself. And so you could say it's almost sort of, maybe you could say that it's internal, always present internally, and when you develop your samadhi and panya, your wisdom and your concentration of wisdom to a certain point, then maybe the inner barriers that are separating the mind from Nibbana break down, and then you see Nibbana.
That's beautiful. That's a beautiful description. But it makes me wonder if the adjective blissful and also the experience side of it is also internally present right now.
Perhaps.
Because if these
but that would be quite different even from, there are very more exalted types of bliss that are present within the jhanic experience, the stages of meditative absorption. So that's the piti and sukha, elation and bliss. But nibbana but those are still conditioned phenomena.
Same words, it's a completely different category of thing.
Actually. Yeah.
Because you can't compare a conditioned thing and an unconditioned thing.
Exactly.
Even if they have the same name.
Yeah.
And we can talk like this, but we don't really know what this is, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like the other thing is that, for conditioned things, the Buddha eloquently spoke about dependent origination.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? And this seems to be how conditioned things operate.
Yeah.
Actually, you make some interesting points in the book on dependent origination and how it's been misunderstood.
Yeah.
Can you just maybe touch on that, about the difference between dependent origination and, say, simultaneous, mutually, you can talk about these 2 points. Do you remember? That dependent origination is not a mutual dependence necessarily.
Yeah.
We don't have to go there.
Okay.
We don't have to go there, sorry.
I could take it up. I think I know what you're driving at.
Yeah, why don't you?
Okay, so that there's a common explanation or way of interpreting dependent origination as interdependence, interconnectedness. I mean, I think interdependentness or interconnectedness are actually truths, a real phenomena, real principles. But the factors laid out in the formula for dependent origination are not inevitably in a relationship of mutual conditionality, but there is a definite point behind the sequence. And in the sequence, one thing arises in dependence upon another. The relation is not always mutual. But the simplest example is, of course, old age and death arise in dependence on birth.
Yes.
It's not that birth arises in dependence on old age and death. Except
the next life.
Except in the sense that the next birth depends on the death in this life. But even say...
That's a circular dependence, not a mutual dependence.
Say the relationship of feeling and craving. Craving arises in dependence on feeling, especially pleasant feeling. And of course, sometimes when you indulge in craving, it will give rise to a pleasant feeling. But the point of that particular relationship is that the pleasant feelings that are received primarily passively then become triggers that activate craving, and that craving drives one to either hold on to those pleasant experiences, which is one aspect of clinging, or to go on seeking new types of pleasure to bring further states of satisfaction. Yeah. So that those feelings are conditions for craving, but craving is not the condition for those feelings that trigger the craving.
Yeah. And so the main idea here is that there's these certain conditions that create this result.
Yeah.
And so in that way, by aligning the right conditions, you can get certain results.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll finish with this question. I was wondering so it seems very clear on how the law of dependent origination applies to conditioned phenomena.
Yeah.
What's the relationship between dependent origination and unconditioned things, I guess, Nibbana? Is there a relationship here or not?
Well, from one angle, you could say that it is the cessation series of dependent origination that brings the attainment of Nibbana. Particularly, it will be the cessation of ignorance and the cessation of craving, because those two are the origin of dukkha, the two underlying roots of dukkha, of the entire cycle of dependent origination. So it's when ignorance and craving utterly cease, that brings, let's say, the full attainment of Nibbana within this life.
Yeah.
But it is the experience of Nibbana in those breakthroughs to Bodhi, to the world transcending path, that bring the eradication, the elimination in stages of ignorance and craving.
Perfect. Beautiful. So for a modern person,
who's interested in renunciation or getting to the heart of the unsatisfactory nature of the world, where in these books would we find that stuff?
Yeah, I think
someone coming from the West.
Well, I don't know whether it makes much difference west or east, but I'd say that in this book called In the Buddha's Words, I had a chapter called, or a section that's called Deepening One's Perspective on the World. And some of the subdivisions in this chapter, one is the properly evaluating objects of attachment, then the pitfalls in the enjoyment of sensual pleasures, then the transience, the impermanence of life, the danger in attachment to views, the perils, the dangers of samsara, the round of rebirths. Yeah, so those bring up themes that are useful for reflection and contemplation to generate that kind of disposition, the inclination to renunciation.
Thank you. So there's so many questions here. Thank you, everyone.
Maybe if I could just
keep going. Yeah,
what I found very, very useful in my own life over many years to generate and to strengthen that tendency to renunciation, something that's not sort of you're not supposed to speak about in polite society in the West, is the meditation on death, reflection on the inevitability of death.
Yeah.
And so when you do that reflection over and over, it sort of helps to weaken, to debilitate one's attachment to the enjoyments of this life. Okay.
Here's a question related, maybe, but it's on the topic of death. You mentioned the deathless element. How is this to be understood? Is it a concept to contemplate, or is it just a metaphysical statement, or is it a feeling? What do we do with this deathless element? How is it to be used?
Okay, maybe we could take that at two levels. One is a level of what I would use the term reflective contemplation. And this is one of the standard meditation subjects in the compendium of meditation subjects, where you do it's a reflective, conceptualized contemplation of the qualities of Nibbana. So it goes something like, this is peaceful, this is excellent, namely the stilling of all, mental conceptualizations, the relinquishment of all points of attachment, sabbasamkara samato. The relinquishment of all points of attachment, peace, cessation, peace, relinquishment, the destruction of craving, the cessation of craving, Nibbana. So it's reflection on the qualities of Nibbana, but it's not the direct realization of Nibbana, but that kind of reflection generates an appreciation for the qualities of Nibbana and strengthens the aspiration to practice to attain Nibbana. But that is distinct from the breakthrough experience, what I call that's my translation for abhisamaya, direct realization of Nibbana, in which the mind, as we said, turns away from all conditioned phenomena and focuses on penetrating, breaking through to and realizing the deathless element.
I just noticed it seems like you are thinking in Pali and translating on the fly. Is that how you do it? You remember the Pali and then you translate as you're going?
It's the Pali that's easier for me.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Do you find that translating is like an act of, is it a different type of learning? Is it a
different type of learning?
Like you learn the Dharma through translating, is that?
Pretty much that's how I learned it.
Yeah, fantastic.
I mean, of course, I started with books in English, but then to get sort of a clearer and more precise understanding. It's helpful to go to the Pali.
So a question here, can you explain how the understanding of emptiness ends all suffering? Doesn't suffering persist despite the worldview?
Doesn't suffering persist?
Persist despite your worldview.
Yeah, this has to do with different shades of meaning of the word dukkha. And some say that we shouldn't translate it. But I've learned Buddhism by seeing Buddhism presented as the way to the end of suffering. So I would translate, I continue to translate dukkha as suffering, but there are different aspects to dukkha. One aspect is that of experience or experiential suffering, pain, let's say sorrow, worry, grief, sadness, anxiety, stress, unhappiness, dejection, and so forth. So that is felt, experienced suffering in different levels, different dimensions. So with the attainment or realization of Nibbana in this life, that all ceases. So the liberated one doesn't experience any of that mental suffering. Though as long as the body exists, they'll still experience bodily pain. Though it won't trigger feelings of revulsion, aversion, displeasure, and so on. So that feeling, the different feelings of suffering in different grades and intensities come to an end, but except for bodily pain. But with the attainment of final liberation, that is the Nibbana element without residue remaining, then there is no more dukkha in that broadest sense, the dukkha inherent in the five aggregates. The unsatisfactory nature of the five aggregates ceases.
Thank you.
I hope that gets to the question.
Nice answer. Thank you so much. So here's the next question here is around, it's around eco-dharma. So as far as I know, you're one of the spearheads to advocate eco-dharma, environmental avocation from the Buddhist community. What's your understanding of the Buddhist teachings on nature and the environment, and why were you attracted to environmental issues? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about your how you founded Buddhist Global Relief.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. As for eco-dharma, I mean, I've given talks on this, and of course it has to be an issue of extreme concern. And it's something more that I respond to from what I call the sense of conscience as a Buddhist, rather than trying to ground a concern with protecting the environment explicitly and directly in the Buddha's teachings. Yeah. But more that this is something that's going to it's creating immense suffering for people all around the world. And particularly looking at this from the standpoint of maybe global justice, those people in countries and communities which are least responsible for carbon emissions, people in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, maybe Latin America, are going to are already experiencing the impact most severely, much more severely than those of us in the so-called developed world who are responsible for the greatest amount of the emissions. Yeah, so maybe some people can do this, try to find what are principles of the Buddha's teaching out of which you could develop an eco-dharma, but I'm mostly concerned with it from the impact that it's going to have on the viability of human life, human civilization going on into the future. Yeah. Okay, then as for the question about Buddhist Global Relief, yeah, this is an organization that together with some of my friends, we founded back in the year 2008. Plus we thought that as Buddhists, we should be doing something to alleviate what I call the concrete, real experience suffering of people around the world. And so we decided to form a Buddhist relief organization. And then looking for a specific focus of the organization, we decided to address the problem of chronic hunger and malnutrition. And so we started off in late 2008 with, we had a group of maybe about 10 people, 12 people. and we got a few donations. I think we started off with like a bank account of about $20,000. And we started with three little projects, like about $3,000 or $4,000 each, one in Vietnam, one in Myanmar, which had been hit by a cyclone at that time, and the third was in Sri Lanka. Okay, then over the years, sort of, we've expanded and grown to now we have like 60 projects, more than 60 projects around the world in countries ranging from Mongolia, Cambodia, Vietnam, India, several projects, India, Sri Lanka, then going to Africa, Malawi, Kenya, Cameroon, several projects in Cameroon, to Latin America, and some in the United States, about 60 projects. And we've been also working with, we have two modes of operation. One is to partner with small organizations or middle-sized organizations working in those countries. Basically, we partnering with some of the hunger relief organizations that are really addressing these really monumental crises of chronic hunger around the world. But we don't only provide direct food aid to needy communities, but we also try to look into what are the underlying roots of hunger. We found that at least one of the major underlying roots is poverty. And what is it that sustains poverty? In many traditional cultures, the subordinate status of girls and women. And so we branched off in two new directions. One is sponsoring projects to give girls the opportunity to continue in school rather than be forced out of school to work for their families. And so in some of these projects, we have girls from the poorest levels of society in Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, India, sponsoring their education to the point where they go on to university. And then the other branch of this is assisting women to start right livelihood projects to earn more to support their families.
How can we support this?
Yeah, you can go to the website of Buddhist Global Relief. It's very simple, and you'll see.
We'll put the link in the chat.
Yeah, please do so. Yeah. Yeah, we have a very, very good team. I have to give credit to the team. Like, I'm the founder and the chairperson, but I'm the lazy guy on the team.
I don't think so. There's a related question. Well, let's jump to this one. So this is on the term engaged Buddhism.
Yeah.
So this person was surprised to see such a term because it sort of implies that there's a non-engaged Buddhism.
Yeah.
And so he wanted your thoughts on this term and the history, and where does this term come from? Is there a Pali
first,
equivalent?
I don't really like the term engaged Buddhism so much because it implies that there is a non-engaged Buddhism. I think it was originally Thich Nhat Hanh who might have coined the expression, maybe I think he might have used the French expression, sort of pulling it from some of the French existentialist philosophers, maybe Jean-Paul Sartre, who said we have to become engaged. So he used that maybe as a contrast, because what he saw in the Buddhism in Vietnam, maybe late 1950s, early 1960s, the Buddhist monks and nuns staying in their temples, probably the monks more than the nuns, just sort of living fairly comfortably, doing their rituals and ceremonies, and so much integrally involved with society.
Yeah.
And so he coined that expression, engaged Buddhism, particularly because he launched some projects to engage people in the villages and bring Buddhist teachings to them and to show them how to apply Buddhist principles to their everyday life.
Yeah. I think Thich Nhat Hanh also famously said, if it's not engaged Buddhism, it's not Buddhism.
Yeah, I think he also made that statement. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a way of showing that, just the so-called traditional Buddhism of the temples is not truly fulfilling the Buddha's intention of alleviating the sufferings of beings.
Yeah. Any in-house questions? Going once, twice? Okay, I got a ton here. We'll do a couple more if you've got that.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a question here about, doesn't the Buddha speak about teaching the middle way that is neither an extreme of annihilation or strict materialism? And is that is that the being who achieves final parinibbana, does not exist and does not cease to exist? Did you get that question?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I got it. Maybe go through it again.
Yeah, so the Buddha taught the middle way.
Yeah.
And does that mean that there's some status of a person that can achieve final nirvana? That's not quite a, non-existent. The person's not non-existent. The person's not a material, substantial thing. Is there a middle way of person that can achieve nibbana?
Yeah, first, maybe clarification of terms. The expression middle way in Pali, Majjhima Patipada, way, Patipada is practice, which is also translated as way. And that is the middle way is what avoids the two extremes in style of life. One is sort of the blind indulgence and pursuit and enjoyment of sensual pleasures, which was what the Buddha would have experienced when he was living his palace life. And the other was the mode of spiritual practice common in India during that period and even today, and that is the idea that liberation can be gained through affliction of the body, self-mortification. So the Buddha's middle way is the Noble Eightfold Path that avoids those two extremes by taking care of one's physical health and vitality and cultivating inner contemplation and cultivation, moral, mental, and cognitive training rather than self-affliction. But there's another statement where the Buddha says that he teaches Dhamma by the middle. It's not the middle way, but this is Majjhena Dhammang Desami, I think it goes. And that there he uses dependent origination as the teaching that goes in the middle because it avoids the extreme of eternalism, which posits that there is some substantial permanent self which remains the same and goes through the cycle of repeated birth and death, retaining its identity. That's one extreme. And the other extreme is the extreme of annihilationism, which holds that when this life comes to an end, everything is finished and there's nothing beyond that. So what the Buddha teaches, dependent origination, is the middle way because it shows how the cycle of existence continues as a process of conditions and conditionally arisen phenomena without a persisting substantial self continuing through it. And so that avoids eternalism because it denies the self as the agent of the process, but it avoids annihilationism because it shows how, as long as the conditions remain, the sequence of birth and death will continue beyond this life. How it relates to the attainment, I guess you could say that it also can be brought into connection with the attainment of Nibbana, and that there's no individual self that attains Nibbana, and yet Nibbana is not just a sheer annihilation.
Yeah, thank you. This question is about the notion of consciousness that you mentioned and how it might differ from the Vedanta notion of consciousness.
Okay, maybe like the Buddha is in a way setting up his teaching almost as a rejoinder, a critique of the Vedantic notion. Of course, the key to the Upanishadic, or the basic tenet of the Upanishads, is that there is within the person, even behind consciousness itself, there is the Atman, which is the permanent, everlasting self. And then when you investigate behind the world, what is the underlying ground of the world, one finds that there is this supreme reality, which is they call the Brahman. And then the great discovery of the rishis or sages of the Upanishads was that the innermost Atman within, the innermost self, is identical with Brahman, with that divine reality that underlies the world and actually constitutes the phenomena of the world. Okay, so the Buddha's teaching may be his answer to the Brahminic teaching of the Atman, which is the source of consciousness, being identical with Brahman, the fundamental reality, is that consciousness is to be seen, sort of broken down into the 6 types of consciousness, which are conditioned phenomena. So in that way, the person is empty of an inner self, inner fundamental permanent self, and the objects of consciousness are these 6 sense objects, which are also impermanent and and conditioned, and so they are empty of a Brahman as an underlying ground. So the Vedantic teachers say permanent self is identical with permanent Brahman. Yeah. The Buddha's teaching is empty of self within and empty of substantial reality without.
Yeah. Very nice. So quite a distinction there, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, this one is a little bit of a technical one, but I think a question. So with Chetana, since it's a universal mental factor, so this is maybe an Abhidharma question, and it's generating karma. So this is intention, and that's also present. So that's also present in the Jhana mind moments of arhats. Yeah, that's said to be functional. So how come? Why is it that arhats don't generate new karma if they have Chetana? Arhats.
Very exciting. I see the question.
Arhat. Or this question.
Oh, arhats, yeah. Okay.
So arhats have Chetana, why aren't they creating new karma?
Okay. Oops. Okay, so this is a little bit off from what we've been discussing. Okay, so Chaitanya is a universal mental factor. It generates karma in ordinary, unenlightened people, and even in those who reach the first 3 stages of enlightenment, these 3 enterers, once returners, non-returners. In the case of arhats, of course, Chaitanya is present. Chaitanya means volition or intention. So the intention is present in arhats. But in order for intention to generate karma, it has to be accompanied with having at the deep level of the mind, there has to be ignorance and craving. And so for the arhats, all ignorance and craving have been uprooted. And so the volition is present, Chaitanya is present, but it doesn't create karma.
Okay.
And that's a rather technical point arising in the Abhidhamma system.
Yep, that's right. Could you say, coming to the end, could you say a little bit more about the word unconditioned? What Pali word is that translation of? And are there other possible translations?
Okay, so the Pali word is asankata. The prefix is a negation, so it's the negation of sankata. Sankata is what is conditioned. And the way it's explained in the commentaries, the sankata is what is made, put together, produced, constructed by conditions. So things that arise through a combination of causes and conditions. Those things are sankata. And Nibbana is not made by conditions because we said it's unborn, unproduced, not become. And so Nibbana is unconditioned, not dependent on causes and conditions. Yes, some alternative translations, you could say unconstructed. This Achan Thanissaro used, I think he used not fabricated, unfabricated. So you could make your choices. But I've just gone along with the old rendering, unconditioned.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering, as we come to the end of our time tonight, is there anything you want to share with us?
I think nothing comes to mind immediately.
Well, thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. Thank you for everyone for coming tonight.
Maybe, okay, now what I would say, I would encourage people who really want to learn the Dhamma well. I'm not saying this because I'm responsible for these books, but if you want to, in order for learning, actually I would say, maybe this goes against your promotion.
No, that's fine.
But start off with this because this gives sort of the broadest perspective on the early Buddhist teaching. Then to get a concentrated version of the wisdom teachings, then you come to this book.
Yeah.
And once you go through these two, then I think what you could do, what I recommend are the middle-length discourses. And I have actually reordered the middle-length discourses in the way I taught them. I gave teachings on about 60 suttas from the Majjhima Nikaya when I was living at another monastery between 2003, 2006. And so I ordered them, those discourses from the Majjhima Nikaya, a little bit similar to the scheme in this book. And so you could find that scheme if you go to the website of Bodhi Monastery in New Jersey, and there on the teachings, you'll find they still preserve my audio teachings on those suttas.
We'll put the link in the show notes to that.
Yeah, okay, that's
good.
And
if people haven't seen in the chat, there's some great discount codes for these books. So check out the codes there. I think there's like even 50% off this one. So that's great. Thank you so much. This has been an honor and a pleasure, such a privilege. Thank you. Thank you for joining us on Wisdom Dharma Chats.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for joining us.
Okay. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.